This is the dirt that built America.
It's early spring, 1748, and somewhere in the Shenandoah Valley, which at this point doesn't mean anything to anybody in London, and in reality doesn't mean much to anybody in Williamsburg either, there's a 16-year-old kid trying to sleep in a lean-to. He's cold. He's been cold for days. And that lean-to isn't doing much for him. Not against the wind, and definitely not against the rain, because Virginia backcountry rain in March has a way of finding you no matter how you stack the brush over your head. Here's the thing, though. He wrote about it that night in his diary, and I want to actually read you what he wrote because it's far better than anything I could paraphrase. Quote, "Our suppers was got in the best manner without either cloth or dishes. After being tired with the works of the day, we were lighted into a room, and I, not being so good a woodsman as the rest of my company, straightened myself very orderly and went into the bed. To my surprise, I found it was to lay upon a little straw, with only one threadbare blanket with double its weight of vermin, such as lice and fleas." End quote. I love that line. He'd rather sleep on the ground by the fire in his actual clothes than go through that again. And after that first night, that's exactly what he did for the rest of the trip. The kid's name? George Washington. No, he's not a general yet, and he's not the president. He's not the guy on the dollar bill and the quarter and the side of a mountain that hadn't even gotten touched at this point. Just a teenager with a compass and a survey chain, out there getting eaten alive by bugs because he'd gotten his surveyor's license from William and Mary at 17, one of the youngest ages the colony allowed. And this is the part of the story that I think gets skipped or gets one sentence and moved past too fast. While this kid is cold and miserable and picking lice out of a blanket, he's also working. He's measuring this valley. He's helping figure out who's going to end up owning it. By 18, he's used what he's learned out here to buy his own first 1,500 acres in that same valley. By the time Washington died 51 years later, he held something north of 50,000 acres spread across 5 states. The father of his country was, among other things, one of the most aggressive land speculators in colonial American history. And here's why I'm opening with him instead of a headline about zoning or property taxes. This whole series is basically me asking one question over and over in different centuries. How did we get here? How did land in this country end up owned the way it's owned, developed the way it's developed, priced the way it's priced? And it turns out you can't answer that question without talking about people. Specific, flawed, occasionally ridiculous people. Starting with this one. Okay, so before I get back to Washington, I need to give you some context, because otherwise the next part of his story doesn't really land right. And I want to hit you with a number first because it's easy to hear a stat like this and let it just slide past you without actually sitting with it. In 1700, 90% of the colonial American population farmed for a living. 9 in 10. Think about that for a second. If you walked into a tavern in Williamsburg in 1700, 9 out of every 10 people in that room went home to a farm. Not a hobby farm, not a weekend thing, not a homestead. Their whole physical existence every day was dirt, clearing trees that had never been cleared, breaking ground that had never been broken. This was not the picture you get in the paintings later, the pastoral daydream. It was brutal, uncertain labor with failure built right into the system. You cleared the forest by hand. You prayed it didn't frost in May because a frost in May could wipe out a whole year overnight. And if you survived all that, you maybe ended up with a small surplus to sell. So who actually got rich? Not those people. The people who got wealthy were the ones who owned the land that the other people farmed. And I think this is the actual answer to how did we get here for the next 300 years of American land. It starts with a scam, a well meaning scam, but a scam nonetheless. It's called the headright system. And honestly, once you understand how it worked, you start seeing the shape of everything else in this country's history. It's the first version of a pattern that just keeps repeating. 1618. The Virginia Company of London has been pouring money into Jamestown since 1607 and watching it disappear into a swamp. Not figuratively, an actual swamp. Colonists keep dying. There's no profit. If you want a modern comparison, the investors sitting in London at this point are basically people who put money into a startup 3 years ago and still haven't seen a product ship. So the company's treasurer, a guy named Sir Edwin Sandys, comes up with an idea. The colony needs workers. England has a surplus of poor people with nothing keeping them there. So the company makes an announcement. Bring a person to Virginia, get 50 acres. 10 people, 500 acres. 100 people, 5,000 acres. Simple enough plan. Populate the colony, get bodies on the ground. And here's what I love about this story. It takes almost no time at all for someone to find the loophole. You didn't have to farm the land to claim it. You just had to pay for someone's boat ticket and file the paperwork. So wealthy planters start buying up passage rights. Pay £6, roughly a decent coat's worth of money back in London, for an indentured servant's crossing and claim the 50 acres yourself. The servant gets a rough Atlantic crossing and a job in a tobacco field. The planter gets frontier land for the price of an overcoat. And then it gets sloppier. Ship captains realize they can claim headrights for their own sailors. Guys who are under contract, not immigrating anywhere, get claimed anyway. Some planters resubmit the same names to different county courts, claiming the same servants twice, sometimes 3 times over in the surviving records historians have gone through. This isn't a rumor. It's a documented pattern across colonial Virginia land records. And it's exactly the kind of thing that happens whenever the person checking the paperwork is overworked, underpaid, and not particularly motivated to catch it. The Virginia Company itself collapses in 1624. Debt plus a catastrophic uprising that kills a third of the colony in a single day. Story for another time. But the headright system doesn't die with it. The Crown keeps it running until 1699. That's 75 years later. By the time it ends, it's done exactly the opposite of what it was designed to do. It built an entrenched class of Virginia planters holding thousands of acres apiece, most of which they leased to tenant farmers or sold at a markup once the land got valuable enough to be worth something. The farmers worked the ground, the landowners held the deed. And that arrangement, set up in the very first decades of English settlement in what becomes the United States, is, in one form or another, still how this country's land works. Now, let's go back to young George Washington. He deserves more than the one line the textbook gives him, and because what happens next is one of the strangest chains of cause and effect in American history, a chain that starts with a land deal and ends, improbably, with a war fought on 3 continents. After his time surveying the Shenandoah, Washington's older half-brothers pull him into something called the Ohio Company of Virginia, a land speculation venture that had secured a grant of 200,000 acres in the Ohio River Valley straight from the British Crown. There was one problem. The Ohio Valley at this point is contested ground. The French have their own claims to it, And unlike the British, the French are actively backing those claims up, building a chain of forts down through the river valley to make the point physically, not just on paper. Virginia's governor sends the 21-year-old Washington out with a message for the French commander. Leave. This is our land. The French commander declines, politely by all accounts, but firmly. Washington reports back. The governor's response is to send him out again, this time not with a letter, but with a militia. On the way, Washington receives word that a French party is moving towards his position through the woods in what is now southwestern Pennsylvania. So, he makes a decision. He marches his militia through a night with no moon, in the rain, and at dawn he surrounds the French camp. And then he attacks. What happened in the next quarter hour is one of those moments in history where the two sides' accounts diverge so completely that you start to understand why historians drink quite a bit. Washington's own account calls it a quarter of an hour of pretty smart fighting. The French survivors, and there were French survivors, which matters, described something very different. An ambush without warning in which their diplomatic envoy, a man carrying in effect a message under a flag of truce, was killed after he had surrendered, possibly scalped by Washington's Native American allies, with Washington standing close enough to see it happen. What isn't disputed by either side, most of the French party, including their diplomatic representative, ended up dead. And that skirmish, a 21-year-old surveyor's militia attack in the Pennsylvania woods over a land claim, triggered the French and Indian War, which was itself one theater of a much larger conflict, the 7 Years' War, fought across 3 continents, sometimes called history's first genuine world war. Washington wrote home to his brother John Augustine right after the fighting. And here is the line in full, exactly as he wrote it. Quote, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." End quote. He was 21 years old. There's a coda to that quote worth knowing. When the letter got back to London, it reportedly found its way to King George II, who read that line, a young colonial officer saying he found something charming about being shot at, and remarked dryly that Washington wouldn't say that if he'd heard many. It's a small detail, but it tells you 2 things at once. First, this early, Washington already had a sense of his own story. And second, people in London were already paying attention to him for it. Now, here's the part I think gets skipped over way too fast because it's the actual hinge between colonial squabble and national identity. And it's still about land the whole way through. Britain wins the war. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 kicks France off the continent entirely. France hands everything east of the Mississippi to Britain and hands Louisiana west of the river to Spain, mostly just to keep it out of British hands. So if you're wondering who technically has the rights to the west at this point, it's Spain, holding land that France just gave away to stay out of a war it had already lost. That piece of the story doesn't fully pay off for another 40 years, when Napoleon strong-arms Louisiana back from Spain and immediately turns around and sells the whole thing to the United States in 1803. But hold that thought. That story's for another episode. Here's the part that should make you sit up if you're the kind of person who thinks about land for a living. The king's government, instead of opening up all this newly won territory to the colonists who just fought a war for it, does the exact opposite. King George III issues the Proclamation of 1763, a line drawn straight along the crest of the Appalachians, and everything west of it is declared off limits to colonial settlement. It's reserved for the tribe. And the people this line specifically ruins are not some abstract colonists. They are, by the name, the Virginia land speculation class, including Washington's own family. Now, remember, back in 1748, Washington's older brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, had co founded the Ohio Company of Virginia alongside a planter named Thomas Lee with a 500,000-acre grant sitting right in the path of that new line. Overnight, on paper, all of it becomes worthless. Washington's own private read on the proclamation in his letters is that it's a temporary trick to calm the tribes down, not something to actually respect. He kept surveying and buying land west of that line anyway. One biographer's blunt summary of him at this point, his quest for land was resolute, quote, even when he knew he was not entitled to it, end quote. He wasn't alone in ignoring it. Benjamin Franklin, yep, that Franklin, spends much of the late 1760s in London running his own scheme to get around this exact line. He teams up with a Philadelphia merchant named Samuel Wharton, trying to get the Crown to approve a grant of over 2 million acres along the Ohio River. A deal that eventually balloons into a proposal for an entirely new 14th colony, which they wanted to call Vandalia. The negotiation to get tribal land ceded for this deal runs through a British official named William Johnson, the Crown's own superintendent for Indian affairs in the North. And Johnson, it turns out, is secretly in on the deal with Wharton's group the whole time, while officially representing the Crown's interest at the negotiating table. None of this fully closes out before the revolution happens, and it makes the whole argument academic. But I want you to sit with what just happened. The actual, specific, name it in a history book reason a meaningful chunk of Virginia's most powerful men, Washington included, had personal financial skin in the game against their own king years before anyone was talking about taxes or tea, was land. Land they'd already been promised, land they'd already surveyed, land a line on the map had just taken away from them. That's not the whole cause of the revolution, but it is a much bigger piece of it than the textbook version usually admits. Okay, now we're going to fast forward, jump past the revolution. The new country has a problem I think people don't really appreciate. It's broke. It has no money. And it's sitting on an enormous stretch of land west of the Appalachians that nobody in Congress really knows what to do with yet. Their answer becomes the Land Ordinance of 1785, and then the Northwest Ordinance 2 years after that. And between the two, they came up with something you've used every day of your life without ever thinking about it: the grid. Before this, land got described the old English way, by landmarks. I know you've seen them before. Start at the big oak, go 200 yards or paces to the creek, follow the creek to the boulder. It was fine when disputes were rare, but it's a nightmare when you're trying to sell an entire continent, sight unseen, to buyers who've never walked the ground and never will before they pay for it. So a surveyor named Thomas Hutchins went out into the Ohio country and started laying down 6-mile by 6-mile townships, numbered, not named. And here's the part I find actually kind of amazing. A cash-strapped government trying to sell land it haven't even fully secured yet invented a system so uniform you can still see it from an airplane window flying over the Midwest today. Every deed in the Midwest still runs off that grid a broke Congress dreamed up in a hurry. Now, by 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, Congress passed the Homestead Act. And on paper, this is the most democratic land policy the country had ever tried. 160 acres free to any citizen, or anyone intending to become one, who would live on it for 5 years and improve it. The language of the act itself is worth hearing because it's aimed squarely at the common man. Quote, any man who is the head of a family or who has arrived at the age of 21 years and is a citizen of the United States shall, from and after the 1st of January, 1863, be entitled to enter 1/4 section or a less quantity of unappropriated public lands. End quote. It sounds like the fulfillment of everything the headright system and the land grid had been building toward. Land for the people who would actually work it, not the speculators. And for a great many families, it genuinely was that. Homestead claims did put real people on real ground, particularly across the plains. But here's the part that gets left out. Historians who've actually dug into who ended up with this land, the name that comes up over and over is Paul Wallace Gates, who spent a career studying federal land law. And his read is that well under half of the acres distributed under this and related legislation actually went to homesteaders who settled it the way the law intended. The rest moved the land the way land in this country always seems to move when there's a gap between what the law says and what actually gets enforced. Speculators buying claims off homesteaders willing to sell early, railroads getting their own separate grants, and straightforward fraud, because what is America without a little bit of fraud? Guys filing claims on land they never planned to live on, waiting out the paperwork, and then flipping it. Gates himself called the gap between the Homestead Act's intent and its actual outcome one of the real disappointments of federal land policy. A law written for the common settler that, in practice, handed over a lot of the best ground to organized capital instead. A democracy tried to give land to the common man. It ended up giving a great deal of it to men who were never going to plant a single seed on. The railroads didn't just get land grants to lay tracks. In huge stretches of the Midwest and West, they effectively built the towns too, oftentimes before there was anyone around to live in them. And that's literally not a figure of speech. A railroad's land office would draw a town on a blank sheet, name it, cut it into numbered lots, and start selling those lots before a single settler had shown up to buy one. The town existed on paper before it existed on the ground. And if you've ever driven across the Midwest and noticed towns popping up at oddly regular intervals, roughly 8 to 12 miles apart, that's not an accident, and it's not scenery. That's about how far a farmer could haul a wagon of grain to a depot and get home again in a day. Someone in a railroad office did that math one time, and towns still sit exactly where that math put them. Now, the towns that got skipped over didn't just struggle. A lot of what we now call ghost towns across the Midwest and West were not dramatic collapses. There was no gold rush gone bust, nothing that cinematic. They're real estate casualties. A town a railroad drew on a map and then, for whatever reason, never actually built the depot for. Now let's talk about the men actually running this, because I don't want to leave this super abstract. The Transcontinental Railroad Program handed out roughly 175 million acres in land grants between 1862 and 1871. So a 9-year time period handed out 175 million acres in land grants, plus tens of millions of dollars in government bonds. And it created one of the ugliest stories to come out of that time period, involving the Union Pacific specifically. Two men, Thomas C. Durant, the Union Pacific's own vice president, and a promoter named George Francis Train, built for that business, set up a construction company called Credit Mobilier of America in 1864. On paper, it looked like an independent contractor. In reality, the same men running Union Pacific were the ones owning Credit Mobilier, and they used it to build the railroad, meaning build the federal government wildly inflated construction cost. One later accounting found they charged $72 million for work worth approximately $53 million. The difference didn't build railroad, it went straight into their own pockets. And when word of this started to leak out and threaten a congressional investigation, a sitting Massachusetts congressman named Oakes Ames, who, and I promise I'm not making this detail up, owned the largest shovel manufacturing company in America, started handing out Credit Mobilier stock to his fellow congressmen at a steep discount, essentially as bribes to keep the investigation from going anywhere. Then, Vice President Schuyler Colfax got pulled into the scandal too. It finally blew up. In 1872, the New York Sun ran the whole thing on its front page under the headline, "The King of Frauds." Congress censured Ames. The scandal was big enough that no major new railroad land grant legislation passed for the rest of the century. So when I say the railroad company, I want you to picture Thomas Durant and George Train sitting across the table deciding how much of the public's money they could route into their own construction company, and Oakes Ames handing out stock certificates on the floor of Congress like party favors. That's who was drawing these towns on the maps, not an anonymous corporation. Specific men making specific decisions, getting specifically rich off of it. The railroad company that got the route became the most important landowner in the region for the next 100 years. They remain some of the most powerful landowners in the country to date. One more thing on Washington, because I think it's the best button on this whole episode, and it's not the version of him that you got in school. After the war, he spent a genuinely large chunk of his remaining years doing paperwork, difficult paperwork. He sued squatters on his western Pennsylvania land, and he won. Then he spent years actually trying to collect rent from tenants who were, by every account, in absolutely no hurry to pay an absentee landlord in Virginia. He built a grist mill on one of his Ohio properties during the war, came home to find it had fallen apart, tried to sell it, couldn't find a single buyer. He hired a local land manager, wrote him long, detailed, faintly bossy letters about exactly how to handle the tenants, the kind of letters that read less like a founding father and more like a landlord having a bad month. The first president of the United States spent a real chunk of his post-war life chasing tenants who didn't want to pay and trying to unload a broken mill nobody wanted. History, like land, is rarely as clean as we make it look. That's kind of the point of this whole series. The story is always messier and more human than the official version. All right, everyone, that's the story. If you liked it, there's more where that came from. New episodes drop pretty frequently. We're going to try to keep it on a weekly rhythm here. And the easiest way to catch them is to, of course, hit the subscribe button if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening on Spotify, follow on Spotify or whatever your favorite podcast channel is, if you'd rather have it running in the background on a drive. And if this kind of story makes you want to look at the ground under your own feet a little differently, if you're the type who wants to actually do something with that curiosity, not just enjoy it, which, again, perfectly fine with you just enjoying it, it's where we get into the real current mechanics of land and development that's happening today. How deals get found, how they get entitled, how they actually get built. And what's scary about it is that it's pretty similar to a lot of the stuff that we talk about in this series. Either way, links in the description. Thanks for sticking around for this one. Look forward to catching you on the next one.